us?
Um, it's hard to say. I mean, it's at the moment it's kind of America's out of all this, but certainly the problems in the Middle East are spilling into Europe. Yeah, there's Europe. I think thought it could stay out of a lot of this, and it obviously can't.
Yeah. I mean, Spain is they're out of room. Italy's out of room. Germany, people have bailed out of Syria. They're bailing out of Iraq. They're bailing out of Libya. They're bailing out of Central America. They're bailing out of Cuba.
They are. I think one of the most interesting statistics this week was obviously a lot of people have seen the Mediterranean refugees and how many people were killed and things, but among them were Eritreans. There was nearly as many Eritreans as Syrians, and obviously it's harder, as Libyans, and it's obviously harder to get to the Mediterranean coast from Eritrea. And there's not an instability or anything in Eritrea, it's just purely because the regime's so terribly repressive. But so that was a sort of interesting aside and all that, but yeah, it was really terrible. I think 700 people died in one day last week from this.
Yeah, I understand the captain and the co-captain are actually in prison, is that right?
That does seem to be right, yes. I think it was a cynical business, wasn't it? They took them deliberately only with fuel for half the trip, and then they'd be rescued by the Coast Guard.
Ah, interesting. And they're still charging these people, what, $1,000 or $2,000, $3,000? I don't know what the equivalent of that currency is, but...
Yeah, same. I don't know the prices, but yeah, they're charging them whatever it is, and then only doing half the trip.
The Mediterranean and the Gulf of Aden right now ought to be pretty crowded with all kinds of vessels, don't you think?
You would have thought so, yeah. And including the Gulf of Aden, I understand, has the USS Theodore Roosevelt in it now as well.
We've got nine vessels there.
Is that right? I saw one more was going apparently to try and enforce the embargo on Yemen to keep the Iranians from shipping weapons in, but...
Well, there's some dispute on that, Kyle.
Yeah.
There is a UN resolution that was actually passed last week, but it looks like nobody really wants to necessarily enforce that. I think we're just showing ordnance, and we're showing some of our assets off. We're doing a show and tell, and we're following cargo ships in their wake.
It doesn't seem to be working particularly well wherever's happening. So, yeah.
It's not a funny situation, but it's so ludicrous you don't know whether to laugh or just beat your head against the wall.
Yeah, the Middle East has you like that quite a lot.
This is gonna be another 10 or 15 years, isn't it?
At least, yeah. It's probably more. I mean, something like Syria, for instance, that's decades now to rebuild. That's you're looking 30, 40 years before you get anything like, assuming the US stays as out of it as it has done. If it's got to sort itself out, this is a decades-long job. You
have been a busy man here of late. You have been digging into the Ba'athist regime. Why don't you kind of give us a thumbnail sketch of what you're digging up here?
Okay. A lot of people will tell you that the Saddam Hussein regime was a secular regime and the Baathism is a secular ideology. And it's more or less true that it was ostensibly secular and it had a vague idea of modernity to it when it was in vogue in the 40s, 50s and 60s. But it's something that's not quite right, because among other things, people will tell you, for instance, the founder of the Ba'ath Party is a man called Michel Aflaq, and they'll say he was a Christian, and that's true. But he also converted to Islam before the end, and the Ba'ath Party in Iraq made a great deal of this, and Saddam himself had been turning towards Islamists in the mid-1980s as part of his foreign policy, and then he started Islamizing his regime internally in the late 1980s and really stepped it up after the defeat in Kuwait in 1991. And the Faith Campaign in 1993 hypercharged this again. And so by the end of his regime, by the time it was overthrown in 2003, what you had was a really conservative Islamic State in Iraq, and a state that had also played on divide and rule tactics, had played on sectarianism in the country to keep the Shia and the Sunni pitted against each other rather than against the regime. And a lot of the people from this Faith Campaign ended up as the leaders of the Islamic State, and it was first as the leaders of al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia, as it was called, and then of the Islamic State of Iraq, and then now ISIS. And it's a very interesting thing because now we have as well these documents that have turned up with a man called Christoph Reuter has written for Spiegel. And it turns out essentially the Baathists as people strategized the move into Syria to set up a base, and then they wanted to invade into Iraq, and they've succeeded.
What was that time frame, Kyle?
The Islamization of Saddam's regime.
Yeah, there, and then moving into Syria.
The Islamization seriously begins after Kuwait. It's in the 1990s, but it had begun properly there were signs in 1983, but it was 1986 was the big turn towards Islamism. The move into Syria was in 2011 initially, and then 2012. Because initially they sent in an advance party which formed Jabhat al-Nusra, which is the official al-Qaeda group, and then they sent in more of their own people with ISIS as it became obvious that Nusra was in some ways too Syrian. So that was their move. And then they invaded into Iraq in June 2014.
But they necessarily had some kind of footprints, certainly throughout that time in Iraq.
They did, but they must have been there in some ways. But actually, their more significant footprint was in Syria, because when the Ba'ath regime fell in 2003, a lot of its members moved into Syria, including the Saddam's deputy, a man called Ibrahim ad-Nouri, who was supposedly killed last week. And he set up his camp in Syria and ran an insurgency, especially around Mosul. But also the jihadists, the people who joined ISIS predecessor organization, about 90% of the suicide bombers arrived at Damascus International Airport and were sheltered by Assad's regime and then taken to the border and let loose on New Iraq. So actually the networks and things that existed that ISIS has used to set up in Syria before it moved back into Iraq, a lot of them have their roots in the Assad regime.
Where do the Chechens play into this?
They are they were anyway, the military leaders of ISIS in Syria, because the ex-Saddamists decided not to, in a sense, show their hand in Syria. So they went for the most complicated of all options, which was to attract in all of these foreigners, these teenagers from Tunisia and Saudi Arabia and even Europe. And when they all came in to organize these people with no military experience and no military skills into brigades headed by the Chechens, who did have a lot of military skills from decades of insurgency against Russia. So that's what they had. The main one, obviously, is a man called Abu Omar al-Shishani, who has been pushed by ISIS a lot and is their ostensible military commander in eastern Syria.
And he's still there?
He is. There's reports about every other week that he's been killed, but he's still alive as far as I know.
That's kind of the reason I ask.
Yeah.
These people have more lives than cats.
They do. Well, one of the interesting things, actually, is that they often fake their deaths. I mean, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi's deputy, his overseer in Iraq, as a man called Abu Muslim al-Turkmani, was reported killed in November. But there's a lot of doubt that that's true. And the head of the military council, which is supposedly the most important institution within ISIS. I mean, it's not actually always the case because there's a lot of indirect and lines of authority, and it often matters more with people than actual official institutions. But to take it as it is, the military council leader has been killed twice, supposedly. But there's every reason to think that he probably isn't dead. It's just if he fakes his death, then nobody's going to actually try to kill him. So that's the way they work.
Yeah, well, it's I guess from an intelligence standpoint, it can be effective, but then I think they've caught on, so they don't necessarily know what. Still to this day, from the last time you and I talked, still to this day, there really aren't any kind of intelligence assets other than drones in Syria. Is that right?
I would assume so. I mean, we've seen nothing in the open source, and from the way things have gone, I mean, the main so-called US-backed rebel brigades in Syria have been destroyed in that time. So yeah. I'm assuming the US doesn't have any assets really on the ground. I was going to say, by the way, the intelligence point is a very important one, because one of the reasons ISIS is able to outdo everybody, especially the Syrian militias, which are mostly just essentially neighborhood watch brigades, is because they have the ex-Saddamists among them who are all from an intelligence agency that was trained by the KGB.
I'm glad you brought that little component up, because that was actually my next question. Where is the Soviet influence?
It's everywhere. I mean, the things like, as I say, like faking their deaths, and also being able to put out this scale of disinformation, which is what the Soviets would have called active measures. I mean, all these things are directly traceable back to the Soviets. I'm working through cutouts. I'm working to push your agenda. While one of the things is that initially, anyway, the Baathists probably didn't believe in this apocalypticism. But they push that because they gather in foreign recruits who will fight their local battle, which is essentially a revanchist effort to take back Baghdad. I think that one of the arguments going on now is with the role of these ex-Saddamists is how much they actually believe it. Because some people have taken from the Reuters story that, in a sense, ISIS has nothing Islamic about it, or more to the point, its leaders don't, and that it's really just this effort by the ex-secular regime to take back power. I don't think that's true. I mean, I think it's a hybrid. It's Baathism and Salafism, and it really has fused into something intensely toxic. But the other point is, it did that and was doing that well before the United States arrived. I mean, this was coming anyway.
So what I'm hearing then you say is the devout Islamist doctrine from the top leadership is not especially practiced, but it certainly is an effective recruiting tool and a fear tactic.
Yeah, it's definitely being used by them. I mean, one of the first things they did in Syria was set up so-called dawah offices, missionary offices, and they recruited the people who attended these offices were then recruited as spies. And this is drawn straight from the Faith Campaign, because one of the elements of it when Saddam was running Iraq was that he would encourage this religious revival and would then infiltrate all of the institutions, the scholars, and the mosques with his agents. And ISIS did this. But I think they believe it maybe more than they intended to.
Interesting. Now, what about the Uzbek component?
I'm not a terrific expert on this, but it is definitely there. One of the things with that is that the Uzbeks tend to be more pro-al-Qaeda than pro-ISIS. A lot of them have a loyalty to the Caucasus Emirates in Caucasus, in Russia and Georgia and Chechnya. So that's, as far as I understand, that's where it is. I'm just trying to think of the name of the actual brigade. I think it may be the Ansar al-Din.
Oh, yeah.
Jabhat Ansar al-Din, that's the official Syrian branch of the Caucasus Emirates. But and also Jaish al-Muhajirin, wa Ansar, which was the original group Chechani ran, but he broke away with a pro-ISIS contingent. But yeah, the Uzbeks tend to be more within al-Qaeda's orbit than ISIS's.
Interesting. For the sake of my listeners, I want to remind them that Bo Bergdahl, our wayward son, that we traded 5 Taliban for, and doing the swap May 31st of last year, doing the investigation, he left his post, and his ultimate ambition was to join with the Uzbeks. So that's just for the sake of my listeners out there to kind of put things in American perspective.
Nice. I didn't know that, actually.
Yes. Yeah. And that's why it's particularly chilling. And interestingly enough, at the time, our chairman of the Joint Chiefs was Admiral Mullen, and he knew about his defection, where he left his uniform behind and left his post to seek out the Taliban. Was eventually picked up by the Haqqani. All of that was well known. He left in June of 2009, and it was well known before the end of that year.
Right.
Yeah, we traded him off for 5 Taliban commanders, the top guys in Guantanamo of May of last year, who, by the way, are under only a 1-year house arrest in Doha, and that 1-year expiration date is up June the 1st. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens with those 5 Talibaners. Let's talk about Camp Bucca here for a second.
Hmm.
Now, that was essentially really a behind the bars, I shouldn't even say that, behind the tents and behind a, wire prison in Iraq, where I think a lot of these Islamic State fighters, once they were released, or we turned Camp Bucca back over to Iraq once we left, um, they have now found new homes with some combination of the Ansar component or the Islamic State component. Would that be a correct assessment?
It's a bit worse than that. I mean, the Camp Bucca, its sort of role as a recruiting ground for ISIS goes back really to the start of all this. It was almost always worse than we intended. I mean, we intended to take these people off the battlefield, but in fact, a lot of them intended to get taken off the battlefield so that they wouldn't be killed, and then recruited in these prisons.
Hmm. How much was necessarily manifest within Camp Bucca such that when that whole thing kind of crumbled, was any of this during the Camp Bucca days necessarily their war plans and their future plans developed there?
It's really difficult to say directly with that, whether whether a specific operation was planned in Bucca, but they certainly used it deliberately. I mean, it wasn't just a sideshow that a lot of their top people ended up in Bucca. It was an intentional thing. They deliberately infiltrated the camp to recruit people from among the other insurgent groups. Not all of them necessarily wanted to do global jihad, but more just annoyed that the Sunni regime had been deposed. And they made the connections, they made a lot of networking, they stayed out of the way of the US Marines, and then they were released and they could network again on the outside. And then obviously once the US left, they were more free still.
Do you have a clue on what Maliki is doing these days since he's no longer?
Not directly, but there have been a good few articles around say he's, in a sense, trying to come back. I mean, in one way, he never really went away. He's still formally the vice president of Iraq, and he still thinks he could run the country better than Haider al-Abadi, the new prime minister.
Mm-hmm.
He has a sort of very active network on social media and other things. It turns out if you criticize Maliki or you criticize some of the policies of his regime, you can get fairly badly attacked on social media and other things. So he has a lot of supporters still around.
It just kind of makes me nervous because I mean he was clearly influenced and essentially owned, I would say, by the Iranians.
Yes.
And that I don't think that anybody's paying any attention to it. I keep asking the question, and then I keep making myself notes to go see, what else I can necessarily find. And I'm not finding anything that's really tangible. So he's kind of gone dark, and there's something there that's not sitting right. Would you agree?
Yes, he's almost too quiet, isn't he?
Mm-hmm.
So I think so. I don't think he will ever really give up the wish to come back. There was a great story in the Washington Post by, I think it was Liz Sly, and I'm just going to forget her co-author for a minute, but they spoke to somebody I think it was within the Dawa party and Maliki's party, and they said, why he's created such a mess, look at the state of the country, the army fell apart on his watch, how could he possibly think he's going to come back?
Mm-hmm.
And they said, well, you have to understand that Saddam Hussein's been dead for 6 years, but he still thinks he can come back too. So I think in a sense it just, once they've been in power, there's no stop button. They'll just want to keep coming back. And Maliki is obviously a very insular person, is very paranoid, and before he was forced from office, he had come to see, in a sense, Iraq's whole fate as in his hands. He thought that he was the only person who could save Iraq.
Yeah, that's how we see it. All right, Kyle, stay with us. We're going to come into a hard break, and we'll see you on the other side. All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Denise Simon Experience. I'm your host, Denise Simon, and still very delighted to have Kyle Orton with us, who has been pretty dedicated and done some stellar work on his blog at kyleorton1991.wordpress.com. So thank you, Kyle, for your you just stick-to-itiveness on all of this.
Thank you.
Kyle, we've got a fun operation going on here in Yemen, and you know, the Saudis were taking the lead in doing these airstrikes. They made a very kind of bizarre, what we necessarily might think a bizarre statement yesterday, and they did essentially a halt of their airstrike campaign yesterday, which took, I guess, many by surprise. I wasn't quite as surprised because the U.S. had some of their carrier and missile destroyers show up, so I have a feeling that they just said suspend until we get there. And they tried, they attempted to do and successfully did some airstrikes again today. Now,
Yes.
The Saudis, they're in a precarious condition. Would you agree with that, between Iran on one side and Yemen on the other?
Yes, I mean they certainly they feel themselves encircled by Iran. It depends. If you meant the regime itself, I don't think that's going to go anywhere anytime soon. But strategically in the region, Saudi Arabia has certainly been very badly damaged in the last 4 or 5 years.
Now we've really got two factions, or do we have more than two factions that are operating in Yemen? Meaning, the Houthis and then AQAP. Is there more than that that's really going on there that we're not necessarily paying attention to?
Yes, there is. There are the Houthis and there are AQAP. There's also now a branch of ISIS. Then there's the former president, Ali Abdullah Saleh, who has a faction. Then there's the current ostensibly legitimate president Hadi, who's holed up in Aden with the remnants of his regime. And then in the south, east of the country, there is a secessionist movement, which is mostly tribal and some Muslim Brotherhood types. And among them, I'm sure there are other people who are just in it for money and local power. So it's a real mess. But obviously the main factions going are the Houthis, and the Houthis are being sided with by Saleh as well at the moment, who's the previous president before this one. And he's decided to throw in his lot with the Houthis to try and drive out Hadi, who's America's ostensible ally.
Oh, wow. Okay. So, that just really convoluted this whole thing. So then that necessarily explains why the Saudi kingdom decided they were going to call up their equivalent of their National Guard to augment their army. So is there a ground game that's coming?
Say that again, sorry. Just broke up.
That's all right. What I was going to say is on the heels of the Saudis suspending their airstrike campaign, almost in the same breath, they called up their equivalent of the National Guard to augment their army. So does that speak to a ground game that's about to happen there?
It's very difficult to say, because that's the problem is without a ground game, they can't do anything. I mean, if it's just going to be the airstrikes, it won't succeed and hasn't. It's just going to be the casualties will mount up, and it's just international pressure will build on the Saudis to stop. But it's Egypt at one stage said they were going to send troops, which was quite hard to believe after the fiasco in the 60s with Egypt. But I don't know. I think the Saudis are probably at the moment just making sure that their border is secure. But a ground game could be coming if they think that they can achieve something from it.
Fascinating thing was that the Saudis had actually asked the Pakistanis for some soldiers. And
yes.
The Pakistanis gave that some serious consideration and turned around and said no. Why would they do that?
I'm assuming it's just because they understand that if you get involved in Yemen, it's going to be a mess. I mean, whatever you do, it's going to go terribly. The Pakistanis, I think formally the parliament voted it down, didn't it? But I don't think the parliament is really independent of the military. But yeah, my assumption is that nobody really wants to take ownership of this. It's just too much trouble.
Well, I mean, I I would venture to say that the Pakistanis are about to, they've been having their own issues, and we're obviously in the fighting season now in Afghanistan too. So I would venture to say that they have their own powder keg going on.
They do. I mean, that's right. I'm sure I saw this morning that the Taliban have announced the spring offensive. But the complication with that, of course, is that the Taliban's spring offensives are usually planned by the Pakistanis, so they're not very easy to peg down as to which side they're actually on.
God. All right, yeah. Kyle. How about this question? Earlier, you had mentioned the Muslim Brotherhood in Yemen.
Yes.
Can you kind of speak to that?
I by no means a Yemeni expert. My focus is more on the First Arab Crescent, but there's a party in Yemen called the Islam Party, which it's quite powerful among the tribes, and the Saudis have done a lot of outreach to the party to try and sort of bring it on board, and they've generally softened their anti-Muslim Brotherhood stance, and Qatar is obviously a part of the Saudi-led operation as well. So it seemed like, in some sense, the Saudis were trying to recruit an on-the-ground force to act, but that doesn't seem to have gone very well.
Yeah, because it was the Saudis, along with a couple of the other Arab states, that had declared the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization. And now, since you had somewhat of a regime change in the kingdom, they've kind of change that up a little bit, correct?
Yes, that's right. My guess is that it's because of Iran. I mean, as Iran's clearly just gaining more and more power in the region, Saudi Arabia's looked to reconcile with Qatar and Qatar's foreign policy traditionally focuses a lot through the Muslim Brotherhood, and I think they've just decided to try and unite the Arab states.
With what has been going on then in both Yemen and in Iraq, is there somewhat of a evacuation, if you will, of these jihadi fighters that are finding a little bit more of a safe haven in Syria now? I mean, are there some that are just kind of evacuating and going to Syria?
It's hard to say. There were some reports of a movement of al-Qaeda people from Yemen into Syria, particularly to do with the so-called Khorasan group, the external operations wing of Jabhat al-Nusra. There was a report of this. I haven't seen anything on that recently. Actually, the main movement of jihadists between Yemen and Syria is Iran moving the Houthi Shia fighters into Syria to train and to get battlefield experience, and then sending them back into Yemen to fight and as they have, overthrow the government and try and conquer the territory.
And when they would necessarily do that, are you talking about a unit? Are you talking about a 2,000 or 3,000? Are you talking 200 or 300 that would go into Syria to be trained?
It's in batches. It was reported in Now Lebanon a couple of weeks ago. It's in batches of about 300, and they've done, I think they said, about 10 so far. So yeah, it's about 3,000 fighters have been trained.
And where is Assad on that?
I don't know that he matters a great deal, in the sense that he's a figurehead, but he is being. His regime has just completely collapsed. It's all that is left now as the Syrian component of his state power is the so-called National Defense Forces, which is a sectarian militia made up mostly of Alawites with some other minorities and presumably some Sunnis as well, because there were loyalist tribes. But that militia was put together by Iran, and it's directed in the field by the Revolutionary Guard Corps. And then the two most recent offensives by the regime in Aleppo and in Deraa, in the north and south of the country, were both staffed mostly by foreign Shiite jihadists, a lot of them from Iraq, but also from Afghanistan, some of them from Yemen. They were particularly prominent in the south, and obviously Hezbollah from Lebanon. So, I mean, Assad is a spectator to the fate of his own country at this point.
Swell. And as we were coming on the air, I saw the French weapons that were pledged to Hezbollah have arrived.
I
Um,
didn't.
yeah, and so where does Hezbollah stand in all of this? I mean, we took them off our terror list.
Yeah. Another strong move. Yeah, Hezbollah. The thing is, Hezbollah has largely taken control of Lebanon. It controls, for instance, the airport in Lebanon, and it controls the military intelligence unit of the Lebanese armed forces. It has obviously intervened massively in Syria. In fact, it's the reason Assad is still standing. It's a straight-out Iranian proxy. It's being run by the Quds Force of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. So it does what Iran tells it, and it's a global terrorist organization. It's pulled off bombings from Argentina to Bulgaria, and it will surely do so again.
And it's not getting nearly enough attention, I don't think.
Really not. Like tens of thousands of Shiite jihadists have been flooded into Syria to protect the regime, and it's got basically no pushback from the US, whereas a handful of these old guard al-Qaeda people went into Syria, and the US has launched airstrikes against them, and still does.
Islamic State in Afghanistan.
Yes.
All right, there's your opening. Say it the way it needs to be said, Kyle.
To be honest, I haven't focused a great deal on this, and it doesn't seem to me at this point especially important. I mean, it will be important in the sense that it will continue to grow because the US is pulling back and Iran is moving in, and so these sectarian fault lines are going to open up and there's going to be a great deal more space to move in. But as for how they're doing right now, I don't think they're particularly changing the balance in any way.
Okay.
But it'll be something that develops.
All right, I think that's accurate too. What about Hamas?
Another part of Iran's empire that's come back to heel this morning.
Yeah?
Yeah, it seems Iran has obviously... Khaled Mashal is the formal political leader of Hamas, but he's based in Turkey with the rest of his political leadership, but they don't seem to matter a great deal, and Iran has worked through the military commanders on the ground in Gaza, and it's doing so again by the looks of it. It's the Quds Force that's shipping weapons and money, especially money it seems, to try and rebuild the tunnels and also to rebuild the missile stocks for Hamas. It was also, there was a very good article by my uncle Lee Smith last summer during the war with Israel. He made a very good argument that essentially that war was Hamas's telling Iran, look, we're useful to you. We're very sorry about the whole Syria thing. We don't, we take that back. We don't really want us to go.
Yeah, when they left.
Yeah, and look, we can help you. So, and obviously it went very well. Israel got a real political black eye from that. So, yeah, I think that'll just keep strengthening as well. And obviously it'll just keep building up with the tunnels and the weapons and the rockets, and then we'll have another go-round like we had last summer.
And do you think that that'll happen again this summer?
It's hard to say. It's usually about every 2 years, I think, so we might get off with it this summer and might get pushed off to next year.
All right, so in your crystal ball then, Kyle, if you were to, we have a lot of things incubating. I mean, we've clearly got some hostilities for sure going on in Iraq. We clearly have some hostilities going on in Syria and in Yemen. But something tells me there's some other things that are incubating. And there's some powder kegs that are very close to erupting here within, 4 to 6 months. Would you agree with that?
I can see a great deal going wrong in that time frame, yeah. And going wrong more directly. I mean, one of the things is going to be more terror attacks in Europe. I'm quite sure that will be something that goes on over the summer. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
Would those terror attacks perhaps in Europe would there necessarily be one in Italy? I think Italy is I don't want to damn Italy, but I kind of think that Italy is a little bit overdue because, that has been the threat the next threat of Islamic State?
Yeah, the thing with that, do you know the video I think you're referring to with the Christians when they murdered them in, I think it was January, and they said we're coming for Rome. That I think that was actually more a reference to the West in general than Italy specifically. But Italy could well be the victim in the sense that the thing obviously that's really panicking European security services at this point is that with all the refugees from the Mediterranean, they have little choice but to take them in because they just can't morally leave them in the sea to drown. But they do also know that at some point in one of these shipments that they take in, there's going to be a sleeper agent for the Islamic State or for al-Qaeda. And yeah, since a lot of these people are going to Italy, you'd say that was probably a good bet.
So this could make for a very bloody summer, as I see it. I would venture to say that the Arab Spring is kind of the manifesting part of the agenda, such that things could necessarily break wide open here this summer.
They could. One of the ones actually that I think, if we're talking about the dogs that aren't barking at the moment, one of them is Egypt. There is a jihadist insurgency in Sinai, and since the coup in 2013, that's been greatly energized. It's now, there's a branch of that claiming allegiance to the Islamic State, and because of the mercilessness of the regime in cracking down on even peaceful Islamists, a lot of people who would otherwise be into activists or what the so-called Dawah First type Islamists who try to convert people with social services and things, a lot of them see their only opening now as violence against the regime, so that's something that could well blow up at some point.
In Libya, we can just write off. Is that what I'm hearing?
It can't be written off in the sense that it's going to keep, it will keep affecting us, and we do have a lot of responsibility there in the sense that if you go into these places, you can't just leave afterwards, and among other things because it's not just a moral thing, but it will come and bite you again if you only do half the job. But there are ways of trying to manipulate some kind of stability in Libya, in that the government that's taken over in Tripoli, the Islamist government, has supporters in Turkey and in Qatar, and the government that's now, I say government, but the people who are holed up in Tobruk with the boat ready to go in case they get invaded, are supported by Egypt and by some of the other Gulf states. So the outside supporters there could be pressured into some kind of settlement if the US sort of committed to it, but it would take a lot of investment and it would take just a time and energy, and I don't think that's gonna happen, at least in the Obama administration's last few months.
Yeah. Can we be as so bold as to say that there is some stability now at this point in Tunisia and Algeria?
Yes. Mali seems to be. I'm sure that one of the problems with Mali was always that there were not that many jihadists. It was they had on a map. I think it was an area the size of Texas, wasn't it, that they occupied? But that was a largely uninhabited space. It's like when you look at the Islamic State's area that it controls in eastern Syria. It looks very impressive, but it's also just mostly desert. So in a sense, once Mali had the help given to it by France, it could restore order relatively easily. Algeria's civil war never really stopped, but it obviously has stability in its main cities. Tunisia is doing well, and it's the only Arab Spring state that has any kind of decency emerging afterwards, but it does also have a massive problem in its in the mountains in the west of the country, where they massacred the tourists not long ago, and it seems that because of Libya and other things, that's a problem that's just growing. So yeah, it's gloomy all around, actually.
Okay, well, we can throw in a lot of other countries in here. We can throw in Kenya, and we can throw in Nigeria. I mean, Northern Africa. Unfortunately, we had Northern Africa Command that said that, I think it was our Secretary of Defense at the time that said we will never lose control of North Africa, meaning that was coming from Leon Panetta, who is probably out there in Carmel, California on a golf course now every day.
Lucky him.
Yeah, I mean, he was probably, after he made that statement, the smartest thing he did was go, okay, I'm finished.
Yeah,
and then he went and wrote a book.
He did. Apparently it's a very good book, if that's any consolation, but I haven't got to it.
I read it.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, I did.
I haven't got to it yet, but yeah, the state structure just seems to be unraveling right across the continent.
Well, the United States has deferred all decisions, and so someone else, and I guess that it comes down to a real standoff between the Saudi leadership and whatever they can get, along with the Gulf states versus Iran. And in the meantime, we're just going to keep holding hands and singing Kumbaya with Iran.
That's actually what I meant to mention before with on the Yemen question.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, the Saudis only told the U.S. about that an hour before the jets took off.
Yeah.
But even since then, the U.S. has supposedly at various times stepped up support for refueling jets and for giving intelligence and this kind of thing.
Yeah.
At the very same moment, though, the U.S. was intervening with the full might of its air force to ensure that Iran's proxies in Iraq succeeded in driving ISIS out of Tikrit.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So it was one of those things where the administration said, look, we're supporting the Saudis in Yemen, so all these people saying that we're tilting towards Iran, it can't be true. But actually, if you examine the policy, it was as ever. It was favourable to Iran. And the US's position is still that the government the Saudis support in Yemen will have to negotiate with Iran's assets in the country to form some kind of balanced government or equilibrium, as they keep saying, to form some kind of balanced government or equilibrium, as they keep saying, to form. So in a sense, Iran's interests have been legitimized in Yemen as well by all this. So yeah, it's a very grim state of affairs.
Well,